Hello, welcome back to the Metahumanism podcast. Today we will start examining epistemology, the branch of philosophy studying the nature of human knowledge and truth. For those new to my channel, I'm Bohdan, and this is the fifth episode in my podcast. We are now moving beyond the introductory series. There was a series of four videos I made, and now we're starting to examine specific philosophical issues in greater depth. I made some introductions in the previous four videos, and now we're looking at a very specific area of philosophy. And it connects to what I already covered, but going into more depth on some of the issues. I do invite you to watch the introductory series just to get a sense of, if you haven't done so yet, just to get a sense of who I am, where I come from, what my general approach to this podcast is, and why it's called metahumanism. So that would give you background. So before we begin with the topic of today's video, though, I want to take a moment to mention and commemorate the victims of the Russian attack on the city of Kryvyi Rih in Ukraine on April the 4th. That's the city where actually Ukrainian President Zelensky comes from. That's his hometown. And Russia used a ballistic rocket with a ballistic missile with a cluster munition warhead to strike a civilian target, a location very close to a children's playground in the middle of the day. And as a result, 18 people were, at least from what I know, at least 18 people were killed. And 9 of them were little children. Well, different ages of children, but 9 of them were children. Some were around 4 years old. The oldest were the teenagers, but I know also the dozens more were injured, and some I've heard stories about infants being in critical condition, being treated at a hospital for injuries. So it's just, there are no words for this. It's a war crime. It's a genocidal war crime. And the Russian propagandists and their useful tools immediately, the same very day, started claiming that the strike was directed at a military target, which is a typical lie by them. Russia's defense ministry, in a post on the social media called Telegram, it's a Russian-owned one, said a high-precision strike, quote-unquote, high-precision strike, had targeted, again, quote, a meeting of unit commanders and Western instructors, unquote, in a restaurant, which is a lie. That's not true. As a result of the strike, enemy losses total up to 85 servicemen and officers of foreign countries, as well as up to 20 vehicles were lost or destroyed, basically. That's what the ministry said on Telegram. And these are all just complete lies. And that's an example of what we will talk about today, which is how facts are established and what truth is and why it matters. Okay, so... but first, I just wanted to commemorate the victims. They're being buried these days, this week. So it's horror. It's the worst. I mean, it's the worst possible evil you can think is attacking civilians, attacking little kids for what? Just for being different from Russians. This week, I was also in Washington, D.C. That's why there was a bit of more of a gap between videos. I didn't record any this past week. I was attending the Ukraine Action Summit, organized by the American Coalition for Ukraine. It's an advocacy organization. It has delegates from all 50 states in the USA, plus Puerto Rico. Over 600 people this time. It's a sixth such summit in the past 3 years. And we came together for 3 days to advocate for Ukraine, and we conducted 444 meetings with the elected representatives. So each delegation from each state met with their corresponding elected representatives to advocate for Ukraine and for support of Ukraine and and talk about what's happening, and including this attack on Kryvyi Rih. So this attack and the summit I attended are informing my plan to record a video about the war in Ukraine, specifically just focusing on that, its origins, the nature of the conflict, and I will definitely do so next week. Finally, the last announcement I want to make before we start with the topic of the video is I have also planned to record a video about anti-psychiatry and critical psychiatry movements. This is at the request of one of my friends and subscribers, and I'm excited to announce this because I'm starting to get these requests and feedback from people who are watching my channel or subscribe to me. That's my goal, to build an active audience of viewers and listeners who can interact and shape the content and direction of my podcast and channel. Okay, so let's move on to epistemology. So in the last episode, among other things, I briefly explored the idea that postmodernism may be in part responsible for the enabling this current kind of information ecology, this current monster, what I call, of post-truth, politics and propaganda, exemplified by Putinism and Trumpism. The basic premise I'm working with here is encapsulated in this quote by Anatole France, a well-known French novelist, essayist, and critic in late 19th, early 20th century. He is firmly grounded in the classical humanist tradition, and he won a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1921 for his writing. So his quote is, "If 50 million people say a foolish thing, it's still a foolish thing." End quote. So the same standard applies to falsehood. So no matter how many people repeat it, something that's false, and how many times they repeat it, regardless of that, the falsehood remains false, and just as the truth remains true, regardless of how many times someone denies it. That's kind of the basis we're building upon in this video. The effect of this connection between postmodernism and post-truth, if there is last video I argued there is certain connection. It's not causality that the one thing caused the other, but there is a connection and relatedness, and it's unfortunate because and inadvertent. Postmodernism was criticizing certain ideas which were limited and how they affected our world, and in process of criticizing in critiquing these hegemonic premises and certainties of the modern and the humanist thought as it emerged in the period of the Enlightenment and privileged reason above all else, such as emotion or intuition and other things. Postmodernism, so by critiquing these ideas, it also in the process it attacked the very idea of objective or universal truth. So undermining the whole notion that such truth is possible at all. And so arguing instead that in favor of multiple perspectives, or all of them being equally admissible and authoritative, regardless how false they may be, regardless of their relations to the facts or reality, right? So that was unfortunate. That was almost inadvertent that they undermined the very notion of truth, and it's wrong because it does not reflect how things are. Facts matter and reality matters, and that's what we are starting to talk about right now. So this approach can be seen as a revival of this ancient debate, the postmodernist approach. This ancient debate that started between Socrates and the sophist philosophers. And it was also that debate was rekindled during the Renaissance humanist times, which I looked at in one of the previous videos, in what is known as res verbum controversy. So word thing. Res is word thing, verbum is word. So that was the controversy about the nature of language. Just to recap quickly, one side, which was Socrates and the philosophers of the thing, defended the position that language, or the word, is merely a tool humans use to understand the independently existed reality. Again, the thing, the independently existing reality. The other side, the sophists and the rhetoricians of the word, held that our skillful use of language itself is defining of reality, which in their view did not have any separate or defined substance or existence before being represented in and by language. So basically, it's a view that language constructs reality. Reality doesn't exist independently of language. To some degree, this is a simplistic view of the more nuanced debate, it's possible, after all, to avoid such a stark and extreme opposition by both accepting the existence of an independent objective reality, and both realizing that how we use our language plays an extremely important role in how accurately that reality is perceived by us and defined by us. So it's not either or, it's both and. That's an important point. So in this brings us to the notion of truth and facts and how we can know them, which is the province of the two related and parallel fields of epistemology and gnoseology. So that stems from both Greek words. One was episteme and another gnosis. These are both words for knowledge. They're just describing two different kinds of knowledge and aspects of knowledge, and we will look at that distinction probably in the next video. In this video, I want to focus on primarily on epistemology, and the next video will probably be focused on gnoseology. They're parallel but slightly distinct, and that distinction is important to highlight, and I will do so in this and next video. So these two perspectives, just schematically, may be said to represent two divergent but related traditions. Epistemology is more Western tradition, and gnoseology is more Eastern. That's, again, schematic. It's not quite so simple. It's actually more complicated, but for now it'll do. And these two perspectives, for me, connect through Ukraine, really, because the Ukrainian culture may be seen as situated between the East and the West. In fact, there's a great scholar of Ukrainian origin from Harvard University whose name was Igor Shevchenko. He lived from 1922 to 2009. He was a philologist and a study of language, right, and historian. And he specialized in the fields of Byzantine studies and Slavic studies. So in both areas, he was well-known and respected scholar. And published a book. He published a book at one point titled exactly that, Ukraine Between the East and West. So he had expertise in these subject matters to know the Byzantine studies, that's the East, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Eastern influences, and the West being the Western Roman Empire, the Western Europe, and so on. So both influences play a part in Ukrainian history and culture. So let me introduce this bilingual aspect into the very question of truth. If you ever tried learning a foreign language, you know that it opens up a window into a whole another world, a culture, another way of seeing the world. That's why there's a saying that as you're as many times a human being, as many languages you know. Because each language has its own structure, its own peculiarities, its own idiosyncrasies, idiom, and which reflects the way people of that culture think, and not everybody thinks the same way. So another aspect of language I want to highlight here is that just as with thought, it is a living thing. A language is a living thing. It does not follow some strictly defined logic. It's an infinitely complex phenomenon. We do understand how languages work, but to a great extent. But it's still a very complex phenomena that's not so easy to wrap your head around intuitively. So there are also. Or consciously, we grow up, we learn to speak. It seems natural, but it's a very complicated process, actually. So there are also connections here that I will touch on briefly to the more specialized fields of philosophy, like philosophy of mind, which studies primarily consciousness and interior thought of human beings, and then philosophy of language, which studies more meaning, communication, exterior communication, and reference between the words and things, right? So that's another specialized area. Philosophy of religion, mystical, intuitive knowledge is part of that, is studied within the philosophy of religion, revealed religion or natural religion. We'll look at those terms subsequently. Some philosophers of language attempted to study language from a very strictly logical and formalistic perspective. School of thought, for example, known as logical logical positivism, which existed like first half of 20th century. It's now kind of burned out. It's defunct. It's no longer a perspective anybody really entertains, because what they were doing is applying very strict scientific criteria to language, and they were so strict that eventually they realized that those criteria made their study and their perspective impossible and basically dissolved. Their method was proven to be faulty. Another related tradition of analytic philosophy, which is Anglo-American analytic philosophy, still exists, and it's much less strict, although still applying kind of logical and formal criteria, but in a much more less constrained manner, and so it still survives, and it's being it's one of the major contemporary directions, currents in philosophy. Another kind of opposing current to analytic philosophy is the Continental philosophy. So that Anglo-American analytic philosophy, and then Continental European philosophy within the Western tradition, right? So we'll talk about those at some point in more detail. This points to the distinction between a broader phenomenon of natural language versus a more strictly defined mathematical or scientific language, right? The logical positivism made that distinction very specific and very concrete. There's also a connection here to such ideas as the limits of logic. You know, the logic itself is limited. It cannot achieve all knowledge possible. It has limits. The inherent incompleteness of any mathematical theory or linguistic system. You cannot include everything, all there is, all reality within language. There's certain things escape language and mathematics, right? You can't describe everything in terms of mathematics and language, even. The whole of reality. Some of the reality escapes, because there's a paradox between the idea that any theory or system itself makes up a part of that reality which it seeks to describe completely. And so it creates this problem of self-reference. If you're using language to describe the whole of reality, you're using language to describe language, so it's a self-referential recursion, right? Reflexivity. Language turns its attention on itself and refers to itself. And so this leads to a fundamental kind of incompleteness and a paradox within any kind of attempt to describe a reality fully. So you can describe everything except language, and that'll be fine. You can try to do that. You know, that's possible. That's poetry, literature, science. We use language in various ways to describe reality in various ways. But then when you start examining language and describing language, this paradox comes up, and you can't complete that effort. You can't fully describe language, everything there is to know about language, by using the very language you're describing. Same thing about maths. You can't use numbers and concepts and mathematical ideas to describe all of the world. You can describe much of the world, a lot of the world, and people do describe and have studied various, but every mathematical system is ultimately incomplete because it starts referring to itself and faces the same problem as language. These are important ideas, and I will refer to them in the future, I'm sure, as well. So, well, there may be some arguments to make for investigating language as logical positivists did, but as far as I'm concerned, that approach really misses the mark by a mile, by trying to squeeze a living reality of language into this artificially rigid boundaries, strictly defined. So just think about such issues as spelling, right? There's no logic to spelling. Whether you think of a French language which uses is pronounced very differently from the way it's written. Think about English, which has some French influence, also a lot of spelling issues and problems, and they have contests about spelling which based on that. In some languages like Ukrainian or Italian or Spanish and some others, it doesn't matter because every letter is pronounced. There is no spelling issue. So it's not known in those languages, any the phenomena of spelling, being presenting any kind of problem. If you learn the alphabet and write it, you can pronounce every letter, and there is no issue, right? But some languages do, and there's no logic to it. It's just the historical development of language. This kind of chaotic evolution of sounds of language, and then how we represent them in writing, right? So spoken and written languages differ fundamentally. That's a very important distinction. The sounds we make and the signs we use to write down those sounds which represent these sounds, basically, do not really fit together too well in many instances. And so let me just take a brief look at what at the very idea of a writing system, right? So language started by being spoken, the sounds, right? Making and then forming into words eventually, which were referred to specific things, right? Word and thing. Again, we're returning to that idea. And so there were, through history, various kinds of writing systems emerged, as we know. Today, the basic one, or the most familiar to everybody, is the alphabetic system, right? Where each symbol or each sign that is used corresponds to one sound, or otherwise known as phoneme. So one sound, one phoneme is one symbol. A is A, right? Sound A, letter A, and so on. There's a correspondence between sounds and symbols. But that's not the only one, and I'm going to go through other varieties in a second. But that the very notion of that variety points to how inadequate the logical, mathematical, and strict scientific rigidity is to capture the full reality of language. It's just not the right approach, not the right method. So in addition to alphabet, there's I'll just go through ideograms and pictograms. That's typically language independent. So that's like a symbol represents an idea or an object directly. So like pictograms are like cave paintings, early Egyptian and Chinese symbols, and ideograms are like modern signage on the road, traffic signs, also like medieval alchemical and astrological signs. They originated more or less in Middle Ages, but they were used today still in many ways by those who follow those like those ideas and study them. So the signs that represent concrete ideas, fully formed ideas or objects, right, refer to specific things. They transcend specific languages. They're that's interesting, right? The ideograms and pictograms. Now, logograms is another one. That's where a symbol represents a word or a concept, so called morpheme. So, for example, Chinese characters, Sumerian cuneiform writing, in the clay tablets, these shapes, like a wedge-shaped impressions they were making. Cuneiform writing. So those are logograms. So each symbol is a word or some kind of concept, right? And combination of those can create for language. Next is hieroglyphs. That's also we know that it's a kind of a mixture of logograms, pictograms, and phonetic symbols. Phonetic meaning representing sounds. So ideas, words, and sounds mixed together in different combinations, and those are hieroglyphs. And that's examples are Egyptian and Maya hieroglyphs. Egyptians are probably the most well known. There's also a syllabic system where symbol represents a syllable, like Japanese kana is one example. Cherokee language uses that system. Then there's Abjad. That's where only consonants are represented in writing, and vowels are they're indicated by marks, but they're not written down. And that's examples are classical Arabic and Hebrew languages. They only write consonants out, and the vowels are guessed from the additional marks, like dots and so on. And then finally, another system is alpha syllabary. So it's a combination of alphabetic and syllabic system. So consonant vowel combinations are written as units. Example of that is Devanagari script of Hindi. You can look into that if you're interested in more great depth, but it's basically there's consonant and vowels are combined, and symbols change shape a little bit when they're combined. So it's a more complicated system than a combination of alphabetic and syllabic systems. Sanskrit also, Ethiopic language uses that. So okay, so that's a variety. It's pretty staggering variety, right? And you can't really just narrow it down to some symbolic formal system based on maths or logic and expect to capture all the complexity. So returning to the notion of truth and the bilingual aspect in the Ukrainian language. In our language, in Ukrainian language, there are two words to signify truth, unlike in an English language. Истина и правда. So истина means truth, and pravda means truth as well. And you know pravda from the Soviet times. That's the same word in Russian. It's a related Slavic language, basically that was they used Pravda, their newspaper, and to spread propaganda. It was kind of Orwellian, speak, naming a propagandist paper Pravda, truth, right? So that's an example again of how meaning gets distorted deliberately sometimes. And so that distinction between истина и правда, two different types of truth, doesn't exist on a level of word. So истина means objective, absolute truth. That's the notion of истина. So often it's philosophical, scientific, and universal truth. So it's something that is so universal, unchanging, and independent of human perception that it transcends that perception. It doesn't vary from human to human. It's objective truth. It's often used in philosophy and science, right? So that's истина. It's objective truth, absolute truth. That's the idea, at least. So pravda, and this relates kind of in a funny way to the fact that it's being used as a propagandist word by Soviets. It was used that way. It means personal, moral, or social truth. So subjective, more personal, more experiential, more ethical truth, relates to honesty. So sometimes that reflects individual or collective perception, morality, or fairness, right? So it's not necessarily just confined to one person. It could be intersubjective truth, but it's not, doesn't rise to the level of universality and of absoluteness as истина. Pravda is a little bit more contingent and subjective. More flexible, more culturally dependent, basically. And it connects to the notion of justice. Like in Ukrainian, justice is справедливість, pravda, pravedливість. Spravedливість is justice. Pravda is truth. We also have a word праведність, which is righteousness. Or a word prava, which means rights, like legal rights and civil rights, political rights. Prava, like pravo is a right. So related notion, related semantic field, right? The same basic word with different permutations. So let's begin looking at epistemology finally. Just what it is. It's kind of building up to that. What does epistemology study? So episteme is a Greek word for knowledge. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge, its nature, its sources, justification of knowledge, and limits of knowledge. So it examines how we acquire knowledge, what constitutes, what counts as knowledge, how we distinguish justified belief from mere opinion. It plays a foundational role in all areas of philosophy, science, and human inquiry, because we use language to access knowledge, really. That's one of the primary tools. So knowing the nature of language and knowledge and truth is kind of basic to knowing anything about anything. So it addresses four major categories of questions. First is, what is knowledge? So the nature of knowledge. What does it mean to know something? Knowledge, and there's this definition that comes from Plato, in the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, as known as justified true belief. So it's that notion kind of distinguishes between the notion of belief, truth, and knowledge and wisdom, right? So when people have beliefs, not all of them may be truthful, some are. So if it's a true belief, and if the person has a reason to hold that true belief, it's justified to have that true belief, then that means it's knowledge. So it's if it's not a true belief, it cannot be knowledge. If it's not justified, if there are no reasons to believe that something, even though that may be true, but if you don't have reasons to believe it, it's not knowledge. Like if you don't you can't rationally explain why you believe something, even if it's true, it's not considered knowledge. So it's kind of true by accident, and that problem was highlighted in 1963, most specifically by somebody called Edmund Gettier. He problematized that notion of saying, it's possible by accident to hold to a true belief and not know why you believe in something. So that's not knowledge. That's just true belief, but it's not justified. It's not really knowledge. That's kind of a paradox of that. So that's one category of speculation and examining various issues. What is knowledge, the nature of knowledge, and what does it mean to know something? Second category is, how do we acquire that knowledge? How do we learn something? How can knowledge exist independently of experience? So if there's knowledge we gain, then that must have pre-existed our gaining it, right? Or is that how it works? That's the question. So sources of knowledge, some of the sources of knowledge studied are sensation and perception, so our senses and how our brains perceive sensory information and process it. Basic level. Then there's reason. We analyze that information, we synthesize various, and we'll talk about that in detail in a minute. So reason, use of reason. Memory is a separate source of knowledge. Testimony, so intersocial. You hear somebody say something, and you experience somebody else describing something, so that's testimony, source of knowledge. You don't have to experience something directly, but if you believe somebody saying truth about what they experienced, then you can have knowledge. Intuition. So it's not reason, but intuition. Something you've come to feel, or you know kind of implicitly, and it's also the source of knowledge. There's also relevant nature versus nurture debate. There was one idea is that we have innate ideas, inborn language capacity, a priori, it's called a priori, which is the Latin for before, from before. A priori knowledge, before being born, we already have certain things built into our brains, wired into our brains. And that was represented in history of Western philosophy by a rationalism of René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, Gottfried von Leibniz. Those are the major rationalist philosophers that kind of created the tradition of relying on innate ideas and reason, independent of experience. They focused on that part. We will examine that in the future, these philosophers. Then there's another, so that was nature part of the debate. The nurture part of the debate was philosophers who said that knowledge is gained only through experience. A posteriori, that's a Latin phrase for only before, like from after. So from before is a priori, and a posteriori is from after. So after birth, only after birth do we start acquiring knowledge. That was the second part of the debate. The idea of tabula rasa, or blank slate. So our mind is a blank slate. We get born, and then knowledge starts being inscribed into this blank slate, which has no prior knowledge whatsoever. So that represents the tradition of empiricism in Western philosophy. Empirical meaning based in experience, empirical data, which science relies upon primarily. So by observation, examining our own experiences, that's the only way to gain knowledge, and that represented by philosophers like John Locke, very well-known English British philosopher that influenced American tradition, Berkeley, and David Hume, all English language philosophers. David Hume was Scottish. So that's the second group. First was about the nature of knowledge. Second is how we get sources of knowledge. Third category that epistemology studies is what justifies a belief. How do we counter skepticism? So skepticism is like undermining the possibility of knowing something, right? You're skeptical of something. You're not sure. You're uncertain that you can know that it's true. You doubt things, right? Skepticism about doubt, and that also connects to Rene Descartes, who's a well-known for his kind of putting everything into doubt except the very fact that he thinks. The cogito ergo sum, Latin phrase he used, which said, I think, therefore I am. So everything else he doubted, but he didn't doubt the fact that he thought. He used his reason to think, and so that was the only fact he was sure of, and the rest he wanted to derive from that basic notion that he thought. So he existed, and that's the basis of his reality. He had this idea of clear and distinct ideas. Only those ideas matter. Self-evident truths. This is connection to the U.S. tradition of the Declaration of Independence and the self-evident truth that all humans are created equal, right? So that's the reference, the rationalist Enlightenment idea. And this relates to. This idea by Descartes is called foundationalism. So the foundational idea is, I think, and then I build everything up on top of those foundations. So that's one way to look at justification of knowledge. Another way to look is coherentism. So beliefs are justified if they are coherent with one another. If there's a system of other beliefs that they cohere to, that means they're justified. Their knowledge. So it's not so much that there's some foundation you build upon. It's more about being coherent and having a relation to other beliefs, which together they create truth and knowledge. There's also a perspective called reliabilism. If you gain knowledge through a reliable process of arriving at that belief, whatever belief you hold, that means that's what determines knowledge. That's how you justify knowledge, is that you followed a certain process to gain your beliefs. They are justified because of the process you followed. That's, for example, in scientific method, you follow certain steps, and that's how you validate the outcome of the experiment, let's say, or observation, by following certain procedure. So certainty is also the idea of certainty of is important to all of this we're discussing, because Descartes' is radical doubt of everything other than the fact that he existed and he thought. This kind of skepticism, it presents a problem, right? It undermines a lot. So you doubt everything there is to doubt, and that's a very radical idea. And the same thing about postmodernism, which I started this video from, is that this radical doubt in possibility of objective knowledge, and it's a challenge. And so this third group of questions studies how can we counter that kind of erosive skepticism. And that connects to another idea of externalism versus internalism. Internalism connects to what I described as foundationalism and coherentism. So it's more like internal ideas, right, in your mind, using your reason, by basically building upon a foundation, a firm foundation, building by reasoning and by judgments, and then and making sure it all coheres together from foundations up to whatever you build up. And externalism connects to reliabilism, right? So it's external procedures that you follow that are determine what is true and what is reliable and what is justified. So example is a cat in a room. Both rational reasons and non-explicit knowledge are important here. So rational reasons is like, okay, I see a cat, so I know it's a cat. I see a cat, it's there, right? You can rationalize and you can present language, let's say, reasons why you think there's a cat in the room, because you see it. because you perceive it, and because the cat is there, you know what a cat is, what it looks like, and that's a cat. And non-explicit knowledge is basically the experience of seeing cats before and knowing that that's what a cat looks like. It's not exactly that you can explain every little thing you need to know what a cat is, but it's there. That knowledge is there based on experience preceding. If you see it for the first time, you don't know what it is. You don't know it's a cat. But by seeing it many times, then you identify it immediately. By seeing it, it's a cat. So that's just example. And final category of questions that epistemology studies is: what are the limits and scope of human knowledge? Are there things we can never know? Do we need absolute certainty to have knowledge? Or is it probability enough to have knowledge? How does human cognition shape what we can know? How does thinking shape what we know? And this last question relates to Immanuel Kant, the German idealist philosopher, his theory that knowledge is filtered through human categories, meaning that our mind imposes certain categories on knowledge, and so the way we think and the nature of our thinking determines how we see the world and how the world is perceived by us. So the world exists, but then there is a distinction between as it exists and the world we perceive, and that gap is, you can't close that gap according to Kant, right? So that's he was also a very radical revolutionary philosopher in his time, and that's one of the reasons why, is that he kind of he started this tradition of critical philosophy with his critique of pure reason. He examined very carefully how we use our minds and how we use reason to achieve knowledge and so on. And we'll look at that in greater depth again in next iteration. So I think that's probably a good idea, a good place to start for today. Next, so as I mentioned, next time we'll look at Gnoseology. But in addition to Gnoseology, we'll look at such things as what kind of facts, different varieties of facts there can be, and how you arrive at these different facts, how knowledge is built up from different facts. We can look at different categories of facts, different types of knowledge also. Just some of the questions I highlighted that epistemology studies, we'll start looking at what the answers that the epistemology came up with in its history, and what categories of facts and knowledge were created. And then if possibly that will be actually a separate, we'll see, I'll see how that works out. And then we'll definitely in the future video look at Gnoseology, the distinction between gnosis and episteme, two different Greek words for knowledge, just different kinds of knowledge, different aspects of knowledge. And we'll examine how Gnoseology developed as opposed to epistemology, and how Ukraine is, for me at least, I got it from Ukraine, because as between East and West, and between Gnoseology more of an Eastern perspective, and epistemology more of a Western tradition. Okay, well, thank you for listening, and returning to the beginning of this video, I again want to commemorate the victims of the attack on the Kryvyi Rih, and I ask you, if you're able to support Ukraine in any way you can, I'll include links to some of the charities that do work in Ukraine, and I will be sure to include the one working on children and children's rights, and children's being kidnapped by Russia, so you can, if you are moved to do so, to contribute and help with those efforts. These are terrible things. These are genocidal war crimes, and they must be stopped as soon as possible. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.